What does history have to tell me about Stop and Frisk? I asked that question, but our brethren at WNYC public radio station here in New York recently ran a series in which they reported that 1 in 5 people stopped last year by New York City police were teenagers 14 to 18 years old. 86% of those teenagers were either or Latino, most of them boys. Last year, more than 120,000 stops of Black and Latino. Total number of boys that age in New York City isn't much more than 177,000 or so, which suggests that every teenage boy who's Black or Latino in this city of New York likely before he graduates to have been stopped and frisked by police. So you're a historian. What does history have to tell me about Stop and Frisk?
It tells us it's an old and enduring form of surveillance and racial control. So if we think about the moment immediately following the Civil War, there was the invention they called the Black Codes in every state. And those codes were intended to use the criminal justice system to restrict the freedom and mobility of Black people. And if you crossed any line that they prescribed, you could be sold back to former slave owner, not as a slave, but as a prisoner to work off your freedom after an auction where you will resold to the highest bidder. It tells you something about the invention of the criminal justice system as a repressive tool to keep Black people in their place from the very 95% of the Black population being free. And it's still with us because ultimately, as a social problem, crime has become, like it was in the Jim Crow South, a mechanism to control Black people's movement in cities. Just as Douglas Bachman described slavery by another name, and
great book, what happened to Blacks after the Civil War? They were free.
Right, the invention of convict leasing as a mechanism to, there are many sources, but one was an economic project to rebuild the South on the back of imprisoned, leased African Americans, sold to industry, and the net simply because there was a lot of money to be made doing that kind of work. In Douglas Bachman's work, we learned how elastic were laws like vagrancy laws, intended effectively to empower any citizen and or law enforcement official to check the papers of a Black person moving freely along the word. And if you couldn't prove you were currently employed, bound to a tenant farming contract or a sharecropping agreement, then you were by definition a vagrant, by definition a criminal, subject to, in this case, leasing. So if you're a proper, you're being cheated by the white landowner and you tell him to go to hell and you step away, he can call the police and say, this person just left my property and they don't have a job, they're a vagrant. You get picked up, you're off to a convict lease. Is that elasticity, that ability to use the law as an instrument of control, the ability to use discretion, is exactly what operates in the context of Stop and Frisk. It operated in New York. Stop and Frisk as an explicit policy is not that old. As an informal practice, Condemnation describes numerous instances of happening in Harlem in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. But here's the point. Today's Stop and Frisk, if you look at the form that a police officer fills out, the boxes create tremendous opportunity for discretion. So furtive movement, suspicious things. But probably the one that's most indicative of this is one box that says, wears clothing known to be associated with criminals. What does that mean for an 18-year-old Black or Latino boy in New York City? He has sagging pants. Is that sufficient for investigating or not he's a criminal or not? Does he have contraband? Does he have a white T-shirt? Does he have a backpack that could contain drugs? In other words, it's incredibly elastic. And
it includes a hoodie.
It could include a hoodie in Florida. In other words, it it allows law enforcement, just like it did in the 1870s, to have the wide berth of discretion challenge a person, a black male on the streets, to ask them, where are you going and do you belong here? And as it turns out, if you don't have ID, you could be subject to arrest in the city. There's a hallways monitoring program the NYPD uses to go into private buildings for the purpose of making sure that there's no drug dealing happening in the building. But as the Village Voice reported just a few months ago, a young man walked out in his pajamas to empty his trash. He happened to come across an NYPD officer. The officer asked his ID to prove that he lived in the building. He wasn't a drug dealer. He didn't have one. He was fine. That's discretion. That's abuse of authority. That is the racial context because, and here's where race really matters today, and I want everybody to be clear about this. Why race matters today and defies the logic of Bloomberg that this is really about saving black people, the colorblind public safety agenda, is because no white community in America would tolerate this kind of treatment in the name of safety in its communities, period. You couldn't go into any East Side apartment or any West Side co-op anywhere in New York City and start asking 17-year-old white boys for ID when they were out in their pajamas because their political power in this city and other parts of this country is sufficient to get a politician to question whether or not that's the America that we want to live in. But when it comes to black and brown people, today, as was true 100 years ago, they are subject to certain justice policies. Those policies in Alabama led way into the civil rights era, and stop, question, and frisk as informal practice has been going on for over 100 years.